They said she died peacefully. An old queen in a grand palace, wrapped in silks and legacy. But the truth beneath the crimson velvet was far colder. On the final night of March 1603, the Virgin Queen lay restless on a pallet of cushions, surrounded not by family but by silence. Her mouth had forgotten how to close, her body had forgotten how to lie still. Her mind, however, remembered everything. That was the curse. Elizabeth Tudor had once ruled a golden age, but even gold rusts in time. Her end did not come with ceremony or glory, only with dread. Servants crept like phantoms, too afraid to look her in the eye. For 11 days she had not slept. Not one blink. Eyes wide, as if she feared death might slip in if she let them fall. And perhaps she was right. They whispered that the death of Essex had broken her. The dashing traitor she loved too much. But that was too simple, too merciful. This was a woman who had been raised on the wreckage of betrayal, baptized in her mother's blood. And Boleyn, the queen with 6 fingers and 1 head too few. Elizabeth had grown in the shadow of a mother executed for being too clever and too inconvenient. She had never been allowed to forget. Even as a child, Elizabeth had known how thin the ice was. Her father's gaze could turn warm to fatal in a breath. She learned to smile without showing her throat. At the age of 2, she lost a queen mother. By the age of 25, she wore the crown herself, holding the same sword that had killed her blood. But no child escapes that kind of beginning unscarred. Elizabeth's mind became a labyrinth, lined with mirrors she refused to look into. Trust was a language she never learned. Every betrayal in court was another familiar tune. Yet she kept dancing. For 45 years. Now, as her body folded inward, the mirrors cracked. Figures from her past wandered into the corners of her room. Dudley's voice. Cecil's sigh. The soft scrape of Mary Stuart's ghost brushing past the doorframe. The blood on her cousin's axe never did wash away. Elizabeth had signed that death warrant herself. A woman who killed another queen. And so she waited. For sleep, for death, for Anne's arms, maybe. But even now, the girl who once survived a royal orphaning could not let go. She stood for hours in silent vigil, refusing her bed. Her ladies wept in corners, dismissed. She feared the softness of sheets. She feared what she might see if she closed her eyes. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she still heard the tower's gates swing open. She remembered the scream that never left her throat when her mother vanished forever. Elizabeth Tudor did not die with dignity. She died fighting it. Each breath a rebellion. Each silence a sentence. And in that final darkness, the world lost a queen, but gained a riddle. Not of power. Not of virginity. But of how a child raised in a palace of shadows grew into a woman who would haunt every corridor she ever walked. Before she was the monarch who refused to marry, before she was Gloriana, before the gold-painted portraits and thunderous speeches, Elizabeth was simply the girl no one knew what to do with. She had been born in a crimson room at Greenwich, to fanfare that would be quickly replaced with quiet. Her father, Henry VIII, had expected a son. Instead, he got another daughter, and worse, one born of in Boleyn. The court offered forced smiles. A few months later, Anne's head rolled on a scaffold, and Elizabeth was labeled illegitimate. Just like that, the cradle became a curse. There are no fairy tales in the Tudor nursery. Elizabeth learned that early. From infancy, her position teetered like a glass goblet on a storm-bent table. She grew up in a hall of ghosts. Her mother's laugh was forbidden. Her name was spoken less and less. Eventually, it was as though Anne had never existed at all. But children remember what they are not supposed to. She clung to the fragments. A locket containing her mother's portrait, hidden behind her bodice. A scrap of lace rumored to have been sewn by Anne's hands. She wore these memories like armor beneath her silks. And with them came something colder. The belief that love, in all its forms, could only be temporary and dangerous. By age 10, Elizabeth had learned to speak as if every word might be repeated in court. She mastered silence as a weapon. When she laughed, it was never with both lungs. Her caretakers described her as precocious, unreadable, calculating even as a child. She read Greek and Latin before she bled. She quoted Cicero when most girls embroidered birds. And always, she watched. When her father married again, and again, and again, she did not cry. She took notes. Catherine Howard's flirtations. Catherine Parr's political maneuvering. Elizabeth became an echo of each queen she survived. But no one suspected just how deeply the lesson sank. Then came Thomas Seymour. Handsome. Reckless. A man who believed a princess was a prize to be chased, not a girl to be feared. She was 14. He was 40. His early morning visits were cloaked in jest, tickles, kisses, a few too many open doors. Catherine Parr, now his wife, noticed too late. The scandal exploded like rotten fruit against Elizabeth's skin. But even as she was interrogated, how far did it go? What did you do? Why didn't you scream? Elizabeth never broke. She wept, but never admitted. She denied, but never trembled. The truth remains uncertain. But the mark it left on her was absolute. After that, she stopped trusting even the people who protected her. Intimacy became a mirage. She would never marry. She would never allow herself to be owned. Not by kings, not by husbands, not by parliament, not even by love. In place of warmth, she built walls. High ones. The girl who once cried in secret now ruled through silence. The seed of her reign had been sown in the soil of betrayal. What blossomed was not a queen by accident. It was a woman carved by history's cruelty into something sharp enough to wield it. She never spoke of her mother. Not openly. But sometimes, when the court whispered too loudly or a suitor came too close, a flicker passed behind her eyes. And in that flicker lived in Boleyn. Condemned for being too brilliant. Too bold. Too much. Elizabeth knew the price of being too much. By the time Elizabeth Tudor became queen, she had already buried enough of herself to fill a vault. At 25, she stepped onto the throne not as a girl made whole by power but as a woman practiced in the art of erasure. She smiled as needed. She pardoned as expected. But the core of her was locked behind something no one else could reach. Her reign began in blood and suspicion. Protestants expected salvation. Catholics plotted her death before the ink on her coronation dried. Every face in her court was a mask, and she had learned long ago how to read the eyes beneath them. Cecil became her shadow. Walsingham her blade. But Elizabeth was the spider at the center of the web, smiling sweetly while she pulled the strings taut. And she pulled them tighter with every passing year. She refused marriage again and again, each refusal another stone in her legend. Suitors came with fleets and kingdoms. She sent them home with poetry and promises of someday. Even when she loved, if that's what it could be called, it was a distant, conditional thing. Robert Dudley was the closest anyone came. But he, too, was a lesson. His wife found dead at the foot of a staircase. Rumors spread like wildfire. Elizabeth did not flinch. She simply drew her circle smaller. Power made her luminous. It also made her cruel. She dangled men from threads, feeding on their ambition. The Virgin Queen, they called her. As though virginity were a virtue. But it was a weapon. No heirs. No alliances. No vulnerability. She would never be another consort wife, another body buried to birth a dynasty. She ruled with spectacle and fear. Her progresses were golden carnivals, designed to keep her face fresh in the minds of the people. Her speeches rang with thunder and myth. She was England. England was her. And yet, beneath the silken performance, something bitter crept in. The more she aged, the more she realized what she had traded to keep the crown on her head. Mary Stuart returned to her thoughts like a ghost wearing her own face. Another queen. Another redhead. Another woman shaped by bloodlines and betrayal. They had never met, but they were twins in fate. Elizabeth had kept her cousin imprisoned for 19 years. That length of time had its own cruelty. Execution would have been simpler, swifter. But Elizabeth did not deal in mercy. When the death warrant was finally signed, hesitantly, perhaps even reluctantly, it was as if the mirror cracked. The axe fell, and Elizabeth felt the wound in herself. She had destroyed the one woman who might have understood her. And the court waited. For tears. For regret. Instead, she withdrew. The cruelty of her power was not in its violence, but in its loneliness. As the decades passed, the golden age dimmed. Dudley died. Walsingham followed. Even Cecil could not last forever. Her younger favorites were less loyal, less frightened. The new generation saw only the spectacle, not the scars. Her court became a carnival of flatterers and actors, all eager to write the next act before the curtain fell. But Elizabeth was not yet done. She painted her face in thick white paste, redrawn into the mask they needed her to be. She wore wigs heavy with jewels. Her teeth blackened. Her hair thinned. She danced, though her knees ached. She gave speeches, though her voice trembled. Her body betrayed her in inches. She met it with stubborn denial. What the world called majesty, she lived as desperation. Because beneath the crown, she was still Anne Boleyn's daughter. Born to be brilliant. Born to be punished for it. When they came to tell her Essex was dead, they found the Queen standing in her privy chamber, motionless before a mirror. The windows were shuttered. The air thick with dust. Her fingers clutched a ring so tightly the gold had pressed into her skin. She said nothing. Not at first. Essex. The last man she might have loved, if love was the right word for a woman who had never known it without consequences. Robert Devereux had been fire and insolence, a court favorite who mistook her favor for safety. He had flirted with treason as if it were a mask. She warned him. He betrayed her. And when she signed his death warrant, she sealed it with something colder than hatred. Disappointment. But what the world could not see was how his death reawakened something buried far deeper. Essex had reminded her of Dudley, of youth, of passion, of the reckless devotion she pretended not to need. Now both were dead, and she could not keep the past from surfacing. Not anymore. After Essex, the Queen began to vanish. Not in body, her figure still drifted through the palace like a spectral monument, but in presence. She avoided her bed as if it were a coffin. Her meals went untouched. Her counsel begged her to rest. She dismissed them with a flicker of her eyes. When her ladies tried to coax her to speak, she answered in fragments or not at all. She sat for hours with her back to them, watching something none of them could see. It was not madness, not precisely. It was remembrance. The child exiled after her mother's execution. The girl interrogated about Seymour. The woman forced to kill her cousin. The queen who let love twist into judgment and power into isolation. She had spent a lifetime mastering the art of stillness. Now it consumed her. She began to mutter to the shadows. Names no one dared repeat. Whispers of decisions once made and never forgiven. She saw faces in candlelight. Anne. Dudley. Mary. Even Essex. Especially Essex. Some say she tried to speak to him, begged forgiveness not from him but from herself. But Elizabeth had never been taught to beg. What she did instead was wait. Not for death, she had defied that too long to surrender easily, but for the reckoning. She knew it was coming. For every secret that had grown teeth. For every vow broken in the name of survival. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that legacy was a crown made of iron. And still, she refused to die lying down. Even as fever took hold, even as her body withered and her speech slipped into dreams, she would not go to her bed. They had to place her on a mound of cushions on the floor, as if she were some ancient oracle waiting to be consumed by the gods. Her eyes remained open for days. Dry. Unblinking. Watching. When the archbishop arrived to give her last rites, she waved him away. Her faith had always been political. Now it felt like one more costume she could no longer bear to wear. She clutched the ring on her finger, the one with a hidden portrait of Anne, and stared into nothing. And perhaps, in those final hours, she saw the truth she had spent her life outmaneuvering. That she had never been untouchable. That her crown had not protected her from becoming exactly what her mother had been, beloved, betrayed, and ultimately alone. And still, the worst was yet to come. At dawn, the breath finally left her. It was not dramatic. There was no thunderclap, no celestial sign. Only stillness, so absolute it devoured every whisper in the chamber. Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, the last Tudor monarch, lay with her eyes half open, as if death had taken her mid-thought. Those who found her said the room felt colder than it should have. And in a way, England had been holding its breath with her. James VI of Scotland was named her successor. A man she had never publicly declared, a man she had refused to meet. The crown that had weighed on her for 45 years passed on, untouched by her final will. But she had known it would come to him. He was Mary Stuart's son. The son of the queen she had executed. History loves irony. Elizabeth never bore children, yet her throne passed to the blood of her greatest rival. In death, she was undone by the very lineage she once silenced. It was the cruelest symmetry, a mother beheaded by Elizabeth, a son elevated by her absence. And so the reckoning began, not in some heavenly court, but in the minds of those who had feared, loved, and served her. They buried her beneath Westminster Abbey, beside her half-sister Mary, the very woman who once locked her in the Tower, called her a heretic, nearly signed her death. The two daughters of Henry VIII now shared a tomb. Two queens with no children, no dynasties. Only silence between them. On the tomb, an inscription read, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in hope of one resurrection." But Elizabeth had never hoped for resurrection. She had hoped only for endurance. And she got it, in a way. The myth of Gloriana, the cult of the Virgin Queen, the stained glass in chapels and the golden likenesses carved into wood. But strip away the legend and you are left with something far more fragile. A girl orphaned by execution. A woman betrayed by every man she tried to love. A queen so consumed by her own necessity that she became untouchable by design. We once thought she was a victim of a brutal father, a broken dynasty, a misogynistic age. And she was. But that is not the whole truth. The truth is far more terrifying. Because Elizabeth did not simply survive her pain, she made it into policy. She turned abandonment into authority. Her inability to trust became a kingdom's doctrine. Her loneliness, an empire. In shielding herself from every intimacy, she built a reign that froze the very warmth it was supposed to protect. And perhaps that was her greatest success. Or her final failure. Would the world have been better if she had been softer? If she had married, borne heirs, let herself be ruled by something other than fear? Or would she have been discarded like so many other queens before her? No one wept for Elizabeth at her death as they had for Mary, Queen of Scots. There were no elegies of love, no keening masses of mourners. There was relief. Continuity. A passing of the crown, as neat as parchment. She had arranged it that way. Even in death, she maintained control. But imagine, just for a moment, if she had lived longer. What else might she have become? How many more men might she have broken in her image? How much further might she have distanced herself from the girl once left motherless in a palace too large for comfort? Or had she already gone too far? In the end, we do not fear her because she was evil. We do not admire her because she was perfect. We remember her because she was both the blade and the wound. A monarch born of execution. A woman forged in absence. A ruler who denied her humanity so utterly that even now, centuries later, we wonder. Was she ever truly alive? Or did she die the day her mother did, and spend the rest of her life learning how not to grieve?